You all know that I'm a religion nerd, but something that you guys might not know about me is that I'm also a bit of a personal finance nerd. I've been tracking my net worth monthly since 2017. I've got all my retirement spreadsheets where I'm constantly seeing exactly how old I'll be when I can retire. I watch all of the personal finance related podcasts, and one of those personal finance podcasts is the Iced Coffee Hour, hosted by Graham Stephan and his partner, Jack. So you can imagine my excitement when the most recent guest on the Iced Coffee Hour was none other than traditionalist Catholic, better known as political commentator, Michael Knowles. Mr. Knowles said the following at the 51 minute and 4 second mark.
It turns out that what people have been doing for all of history is usually better than what a bunch of modern radical reformers are doing now.
This is a common attitude among traditionalist Catholics. You won't only see it expressed by Michael Knowles, you'll also see it expressed pretty much on every episode of Pints with Aquinas.
Yeah,
This
90s fashion.
This is American culture just poisoning the world. And
You're
me,
welcome,
little
world.
boy.
There, Matt and guest Joe Heschmeyer, who I'm a big fan of, by the way, were joking around, but they're being serious if you listen to them.
We also had dishwashers and automobiles and airplanes, so thank you for that too.
Those were from an earlier era. By the time we got to the 90s, we were like, we've run out of good ideas. Here's the bad ones.
American culture was good back when dishwashers and refrigerators were invented, but American culture was bad by the time that Genko jeans came out and poisoned global culture. I encourage you to listen to that full segment, because what they really are expressing is the exact same attitude that Michael Knowles expressed. And I promise you, I didn't go searching hard to find this quote from Pints with Aquinas. This video came out 12 hours ago, at least as of the time of me writing this script. And I was just listening to it because I listened to a lot of Pints with Aquinas, and they were talking about it. So it really wasn't me searching for anything. So obviously, the way that the liturgy was done by our ancestors was better. That's kind of like the whole thing about the trad movement, but it's not just the liturgy, right? It's the way that we dressed. It's the way that we worked. It's the way that we socialized. It's the way that we built buildings. It's the way that we got together. It's the medicine that we used, right? It's just technology in general. All of that was better the way that our ancestors did it, and it's all worse today, right? That is a common disposition among traditionalist Catholics. And I think that's nonsense. Let me tell you why. Actually, before I tell you why I think it's nonsense, let me do a little bit of stage setting. I call this kind of attitude of the way that we did things in the past is better a common trad attitude. And that is true, but it's not limited just to trads. It's pretty present in just like a general conservative mindset, I think, right? What is conservatism if not conserving the past, or at least the good things from the past? But it isn't even limited to conservatives, this distrust of change and progress. It seems it's just a part of the human condition to think that things were better back in the good old days. Liberals might remember the past and think about how much less polluted everything back when I was a kid. And they might remember how much less economic inequality there was, right, before Reaganomics or something like that. Both liberals and conservatives agree that violence has been getting worse too, right, compared to back when we were kids. In almost every year from 1992 until 2015, an era in which violent crime in the United States was plummeting, a majority of Americans told pollsters that they thought that crime was rising. This applies to both conservatives and liberals, though notably conservatives did tend to think that crime was getting worse than liberals thought crime was getting, but they were both wrong. Both liberals and conservatives were wrong. Crime rates were plummeting. And the same thing applies to like anxiety, socializing, happiness, the ending of your own life. All of these things have gotten way worse over time, if you ask most people, regardless of what side of the political aisle the person that you ask is on. But is that true? Is pessimism correct? Could the state of the world like the stripes on a barbershop pole, keep sinking lower and lower, it's easy to see why people feel that way. Every day, the news is filled with stories about war, terrorism, crime, pollution, inequality, drug abuse, and oppression. It's not just the headlines we're talking about. It's the op-eds and long-form stories as well. Magazine covers warn us of coming anarchies, plagues, epidemics, collapses, and so many crises. Farm, health, retirement, welfare, energy, deficit, that copywriters have had to escalate to the redundant, serious crisis. That is the question that Dr. Steven Pinker, a cognitive scientist and Harvard professor, asks in his 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And if you keep reading, you will find that Michael Knowles is pretty squarely wrong in just about every empirically verifiable way when he said,
what people have been doing for all of history is usually better than what a bunch of modern radical reformers are doing now.
For instance, in Chapter 5 of Dr. Pinker's book, he looks at life expectancy and remarks that for almost all of human history, life expectancy has been about 30 years. But starting in the 19th century, the world embarked on the Great Escape, the economist Angus Deaton's term for humanity's release from its patrimony of poverty, disease, and early death. Life expectancy began to rise, picked up speed in the 20th century, and shows no sign of slowing down. As the economic historian Johan Norberg points out, we tend to think that, quote, we approach death by 1 year for every 1 year that we age. But during the 20th century, the average person approached death by just 7 months for every year that they aged. And what is causing this increase in life expectancy? How about the eradication of diseases? On page 64, Dr. Pinker asks, how much thought have you given lately to Karl Landsteiner? Karl who? He only saved 1 billion lives by his discovery of blood groups. And what about these other heroes? Look at the over 800 million lives saved within the last 150 years from the development of chlorination techniques, vaccines, penicillin, and more. And we continue to make strides to this day, especially in the most vulnerable groups, such as newborns. Figure 6.1 from page 66 depicts the global number of childhood deaths from 2000 to 2013, and you can see the decreasing number of childhood deaths from pneumonia, malaria, and more. Even as the global population increases, we are making fantastic strides here. I have heard from some particularly radical conservatives, some of whom are traditionalist Catholics, that the increase in life expectancy isn't worth the cost of all this. But I find that to be a really cold sentiment. So since so much of the increase in life expectancy comes from us making huge improvement in infant mortality rates, effectively what somebody is saying when they point out that the life expectancy gains aren't worth the costs that we've paid is that they would rather let babies die so that those who survive can lead more fulfilled lives. If the cost of my life being more fulfilled is a couple 100 million infant deaths, then so be it. By the way, these people who think like this generally call themselves pro-life. Anyway, I will challenge the idea that our lives are less fulfilled today than they used to be in a little bit, actually, towards the end of this video. But for now, let me continue with a few humbler topics, such as we're just generally better off than we used to be in addition to living longer. For example, we are more well-fed than we used to be. Too well-fed, in fact. Take a look at table 7.1 from page 70, which shows that the average global caloric intake is increasing and will continue to do so. In fact, a quick Google says that the global average daily caloric intake is actually over 2,900 calories now as of 2021. This is probably higher than it needs to be, but it's a good problem to have. It seemingly has not stopped us from continuing to live longer and longer, at least not yet. And it has stopped childhood stunting, which has fallen off of a cliff since the 1980s, even in the poorest countries. See figure 7.2. Global undernourishment isn't nearly as bad as it seems, and we continue to make rapid progress here. Famines are relegated to only being caused by intense wars or crazy natural disasters. They are not a common occurrence anymore. Another way that we're better off than we used to be is that we are far richer than we used to be. Gross world product, which is just the global version of gross domestic product, has exploded exponentially over the past 200 years. And this isn't simply a result of population increasing. GDP per capita is skyrocketing around the world as well. Extreme poverty is being eradicated. And it's not true that only the rich are benefiting from this increase in overall wealth. Poor people in 2024 are much better off than poor people in 1924. And besides, wealth inequality seems to be at a rough historical average right now, not a historical high. Take a look at this chart of the Gini index in the US and the UK. If there is anything to be pessimistic about, I do think that this one might be fair game, since the Gini index has been increasing, which means that inequality has been increasing essentially since the Great Depression about 100 years ago, which seemed like it acted like a great leveler, like it put everyone on the same playing field. So if you want to be pessimistic about something, maybe that one's fair game. Well, do you want something else to be pessimistic about? Well, how about the environment, right? It certainly, the environment is something that we get to be pessimistic about too, right? Maybe not. Take a look at the rate of emissions since 1970 and observe how they have been steadily declining despite an increase in GDP, population, increased vehicle miles, energy consumption, and the like. And many of the improvements can be seen with the naked eye. Cities are less often shrouded in a purple-brown haze. London no longer has the fog, which was actually coal smoke, that was immortalized in the Impressionist paintings, Gothic novels, and the Gershwin song and the brand of raincoats. Urban waterways that had been left for dead, including the Puget Sound, that's probably not pronounced, I don't know, the Chesapeake Bay, the Boston Harbor, like Erie and the Hudson, the Potomac, Chicago, Lake Charles, the Seine, the Rhine, and the Thames River, the last described by Disraeli as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. Those have been recolonized by fish, birds, marine mammals, and sometimes with swimmers. Suburbanites are seeing wolves, foxes, bears, bobcats, badgers, deer, osprey, wild turkeys, and bald eagles. Even rates of deforestation and environmental concern that continued to accelerate through until the 1970s and into the 1980s peaked in 1995 and now has shown significant signs of slowing. A sure sign that environmental protection is spreading from developed countries to the rest of the world, and the world's progress can be tracked in a report called the Environmental Performance Index, a composite of indicators of the quality of air, water, forests, fisheries, farms, and natural habitats. Of the 180 countries that have been tracked for a decade or more, all but 2 show an improvement. The wealthier the country on average, the cleaner its environment. The Nordic countries were the cleanest. Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and several sub-Saharan African countries were the most compromised. 2 of the deadliest forms of pollution, contaminated drinking water and indoor cooking smoke, are afflictions of poor countries only. We are becoming more peaceful too. The world's most impressive militaries are fighting fewer and fewer wars. Genocide deaths are less common as well. Though I should note, as this book was published in 2018, neither the war nor the genocide going on in Ukraine and Palestine are included, since, both of those are still ongoing. Genocide and war aren't the only ways in which we've been killing each other, though, right? Plain old homicide is a fairly common way of us killing each other, and that's been dropping drastically over the course of human history. In recent history, that trend is somewhat harder to see in certain countries. The homicide rates in the UK and the US since 1965 don't seem to have moved incredibly, but globally, even just the progress since 1965 is visible. So even though we will always see spikes in violent crime in certain places for certain durations, the global long-term trend has been improving for the past couple hundred years. Accidental deaths have seen huge strides as well. Motor vehicle deaths have been improving steadily since the invention of the motor vehicle. Plane crash deaths have improved since the invention of the plane. The now ubiquitous sprinklers, smoke detectors, fire doors, fire escapes, fire drills, fire extinguishers, and fire retardant materials are putting fire departments out of business. About 96% of their calls are for cardiac arrest and other medical emergencies, and most of the remainder are for small fires. A typical firefighter will see just one burning building every other year. Listening to all the different ways that things are getting better is probably getting tiring, and I might be losing some of you all, so I'm going to rapid fire the next bunch before I jump to the real kicker. Democracy is rising and autocracy is falling. More countries are passing laws to protect basic human rights, and this refers to things like outlawing torture and outlawing jailing your political enemies. Child labor is becoming rarer and rarer. Literacy rates are skyrocketing. Access to basic education has become widespread, available to essentially anyone living in a developed country, no matter how poor you might be if you do live in that developed country. And that education is helping us. We are becoming smarter, at least when we measure by IQ. People are actually able to retire, which was, kind of unheard of in the 1880s, and it was much more common just to work until you literally couldn't anymore. The amount of time spent doing housework has plummeted thanks to the increased availability of things like running water, electricity, vacuums, washing machines, stoves, etc. This one is crazy. The percent of money that the average American spends on necessities versus wants has essentially inverted itself over the past 100 years. More people are traveling and seeing more of the world than ever before. And this brings me perhaps to the most important part of this video essay. Until this point, a conservative trad could probably have agreed with every single point that I made and then said something like this.
Yes, Kevin, I will grant you all of this, but the fact still remains that we are less happy today than we were pre-Vatican II. We live longer, we are safer, and we are healthier, and we travel more, but we are less fulfilled. We are anxious and depressed in ways that our ancestors simply were not.
Let me build up this case before I see if I can tear it down. In 1999, American political scientist John Muller wrote that people seem simply to have taken the remarkable economic improvements in stride and have definitely found new concerns to get upset about. In an important sense, then, things never get better. And before that, in 1973, the economist Richard Easterlin identified a paradox that has been named after him. Though in comparison within a country, richer people are happier, in comparison across countries, the richer ones appeared to be no happier than the poorer ones. And in comparison over time, people did not appear to get happier as countries got richer. The Easterlin paradox was explained within two theories from psychology. According to the theory of the hedonic treadmill, people adapt to changes of their fortune, like eyes adapting to light or darkness, and then quickly return to a genetically determined baseline. According to this theory of social comparison, or reference group, status anxiety, or relative deprivation, which we examined in Chapter 9, people's happiness is determined by how well they think they are doing relative to their compatriots. So, as the country as a whole gets richer, no one feels happier. Indeed, if their country becomes more unequal, then even if they get richer, they may feel worse. If, in this sense, things never get better, one can wonder whether all of this economic, medical, and technological so-called progress was worth it. Many argue that it was not. We have been spiritually impoverished, they say, by the rise of individualism, materialism, consumerism, and decadent wealth, and by the erosion of the traditional communities with their hearty social bonds and their sense of meaning and purpose bestowed by religion. This is why one often reads depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicide have been soaring, and why Sweden, the secular paradise, has a famously high rate of suicide. In 2016, the activist George Monbiot prosecuted the cultural pessimists' time-honored campaign against modernity in an op-ed entitled "Neoliberalism is Creating Loneliness." And that's what's wrenching society apart. The tagline was, "Epidemics of mental illness are crushing the minds and bodies of millions. It's time to ask where we are heading and why." The article itself warned the latest catastrophic figures for children's mental health in England reflect a global crisis. If all of those extra years of life and health, all of that additional knowledge and leisure and breadth of experience, all of the advances in peace and safety and democracy and rights have really left us no happier, but just lonelier and more suicidal, it would be history's greatest joke on humanity. This is where I plan to land my killing blows to this argument from Michael Knowles. Even these points, that we are more likely to end our own lives, we're more likely to be lonely, we're more likely to be less happy compared to our ancestors' generations. As true as those claims might sound to my trad listeners, that simply isn't true. It's not true that we are less happy today than we were in the past. Generally speaking, we are not ending our own lives at higher rates than we used to. We are not lonelier, and we are not less happy. Let's start with the most straightforward one, causing yourself not to live anymore. This one is surprisingly hard to gather data on for any pre-modern era. One thing to note, though, is that it was common enough that it was debated in ancient cultures, it was debated in ancient Greece, and it was depicted in the Bible, most notably in the story of Judas, but also Saul. Remember how Saul kills himself by falling on his own sword after his sons are killed in battle? Anyway, charting the data from the time that we have reliable data means that we have about 150 years worth of reliable data. And if it was a trend here, it would be moderately declining over time. The past 30 years in Sweden look great, but we won't know if this trend continues until more time passes. The US looks essentially flat over the past 150 years, with us being at a recent high, but not an all-time high. And each of these countries that we have reliable data for have had higher suicide rates in the past than they do have today. Dr. Pinker says that the alarmism of the recent New York Times headline, U.S. suicide rates surged to a 30-year high, is misplaced, as that headline could have equally been titled, "Despite the recession and an aging population, U.S. suicide is a third lower than previous peaks." All right, maybe we aren't being so drastic compared to historical figures, but certainly we are lonelier today, right? Wrong again. First of all, why is my generation so uniquely lonely was not asked for the first time in 2018 or something. The Lonely Crowd was published in 1950. Yes, that 1950, the one that came before Vatican II. In 1966, the Beatles were wondering where all the lonely people come from. But both of those were before social media, and certainly the internet has made us lonelier. But Dr. Pinker sets the record straight. The data show that the idea that the internet has made us lonelier is false. There is no loneliness epidemic. Surveys of the subjective feeling of loneliness are hard to come by, at least for adult populations. But for students, loneliness data is more readily available. And so we can see the rates of loneliness have been dropping across the board since 1978 through until 2012. According to a 2011 study, users of social media have more close friends, express more trust in people, and feel more supported and are more politically involved. And notwithstanding the rumor that social media users are drawn into an anxious competition to keep up with the furious rate of enjoyable activities of their digital faux friends, social media users do not report higher levels of stress than non-users, according to a 2015 study. It actually appears that among women anyway, those who regularly use social media are less stressed than those who do not, with one telling exception. They do get more stressed when they learn that someone they care about has suffered an illness, a death in the family, or some other setback. Social media users care too much, not too little, about other people, and they empathize with them over their troubles, rather than envying them their successes. Okay, but the one final, the big main claim that trads and conservatives make, the claim that underlies the claim that
what people have been doing for all of history is usually better than what a bunch of modern radical reformers are doing now.
Let's start with where we are today, because like loneliness, happiness isn't the easiest thing to measure. Americans are by no means unhappy. Almost 90% rate themselves as at least pretty happy, and almost a third rate themselves as very happy. When they are asked to place themselves on the 10-rung ladder from worst to best possible life, Americans choose the 7th rung. This comes from studies conducted in 2008, 2011, 2015, and 2016. And how does this compare to the American past? Certainly, we were more than 90% pretty happy back in the 50s before Vatican II made us all sad because then we couldn't hear Gregorian chant anymore, right? Not really. According to Dr. Pinker, American happiness has fluctuated within a narrow band since 1947, deflecting in response to various recessions, recoveries, malaises, and bubbles, but with no consistent rise or fall. One dataset shows a slight decline in American happiness from 1955 to 1980, followed by a rise from 1980 through 2006. Another shows a slight decline in the proportion saying that they are very happy starting in 1972, though even the sum there of those who say that they're very happy versus pretty happy hasn't changed. And an interesting point to make is that happiness might not even really be what trads are after in the first place. Happiness might not paint the full picture. My caricature of the trad in this video essay has used the word fulfilled to describe what they're really after. And fulfillment might be even harder to capture empirically than happiness. But what has been captured, which might be a proxy for fulfillment, is excitement. Take a look at this graph. Even though only about a third of Americans have been consistently calling themselves very happy, about half have said that their lives are very exciting. Dr. Pinker refers to an article published in the Journal of Positive Psychology in 2013 called Some Key Differences Between a Happy Life and a Meaningful Life. And I found this article, and I would like to read from that article to you. On page 11, the authors relay that their findings depict the unhappy but meaningful life as seriously involved in difficult undertakings. It was marked by ample worry, stress, argument, and anxiety. And they added that these individuals may be relatively unhappy. So to be fulfilled might actually counteract some of the happiness. So perhaps excitement is actually more important than happiness. Granted, excitement hasn't increased a whole lot either, but it is interesting to note here that happiness, which also hasn't really moved, isn't everything anyway. Okay, so in virtually every empirically verifiable way, our lives are getting better. And the claim that we moderns are much more sad and lonely than our ancestors, that we are much more likely to end our own lives, simply isn't borne out in the data. I think that this all thoroughly debunks the claim that trads and trad-minded people make. The claim that
what people have been doing for all of history is usually better than what a bunch of modern radical reformers are doing now.
So I will ask, what does Michael Knowles mean by everything being better back then? How is it the case that when virtually every empirically measurable metric shows that things are generally much better now than they ever have been in human history? Regarding that how is it better back then question, I came across a figure in Dr. Pinker's book that I purposely skipped but would like to revisit now. Figure 15.1. Racist, sexist, and homophobic opinions, U.S. from 1987 to 2012. And I would like to, in particular, look at the line that states that, quote, women should return to their traditional roles in society. The rates at which people agreed with that statement dropped significantly from 1987 until 2012. And I have a feeling that over the 12 years since 2012, it has dropped significantly more. I think that this is what trads are referring to a lot of the time. It's the whole, I wish that today I could still openly talk about how I think that women belong in the kitchen and not in the workplace. That is what was better back in the day, that they could publicly say that. And you know what's funny? In that same Pints with Aquinas podcast episode, remember way back at the beginning, I know this has been a really long video, Matt and Joe said the following.
I don't know. Now I think I'm okay with a bit of bullying.
Okay. Maybe it's not literally as bad as it sounds. Matt clarifies after a minute. Let me play that clip.
Back in the day when we could yell things at each other, there was a way to sort of show the group this behavior is unacceptable.
Right.
Okay, and what kind of things should we all be ashamed of, Matt?
Like to tattoo your face and dye your hair purple and wear ripped jeans that are barely holding on, something like that. Like having someone in your community say, you look stupid, might be extremely helpful for that person. But if we're no longer allowed to express those opinions, then...
Tattoos and hair color? Okay. Here's the thing. We still do this, Matt. We, as a modern American culture, absolutely shame some people still. We shame people who try to publicly say that a woman's place is in the kitchen, or people who literally want to bring back a Catholic monarchy, or people who want to make gay marriage illegal again. We shame people for a lot of stuff. Just not the stuff that you want to be able to publicly shame people about. You want it to be fine to publicly shame people who dye their hair or wear clothes that you don't like. You want to be able to publicly shame gay people and trans people. And honestly, people like Knowles and Frad would also probably like to be able to publicly shame people for something like not going to Mass on the Feast of the Ascension, which is a holy day of obligation in the United States. But they can't. Not outside of their little bubbles anyway, not the bubbles in Steubenville or St. Mary's or wherever. Enlightenment values are winning. And thanks to those Enlightenment values winning, the world is becoming a better and better and better place over time by every empirically testable method. And that growth will continue as long as we don't let counter-Enlightenment thinkers like Knowles, Frad, and others to take control of things. Thanks, everyone. I wanted to add one more point, but ending the video on the note that I ended the video on felt right to me, so consider this an epilogue. One final question that I wanted to ask is, the final question that I answered was how was it better back then? And my response was, it was better back then because we got to publicly voice these opinions that we have now that we get mocked for now, such as telling women that they don't belong in the workforce and stuff like that. But there's another question that I haven't answered yet, so I'm answering it in this epilogue, and that question is why? Why are trads and conservatives so pessimistic about how things are now? And I think that I can answer that question the same way that I answered the question about why do quacks like Dr. Paul Saladino or Liver King, the professional steroid taker, why do they advocate so much for eating raw organs? That might be like a weird, like how are these two things related? It's because all of these examples, they have something to sell. Have you heard of Heart and Soil or ancestral supplements? The ads, I mean, I get the ads everywhere on YouTube. I don't know if like the algorithm is just different for you, but both Liver King and Paul Saladino, MD, advocate for eating organs, and they know that their audience is going to want to look like them. They're going to want to like look shredded, or they're going to want to look beefy. And so, hey, if you want to look like me, you should eat these organs. Oh, you're grossed out by eating raw organs? Guess what? I just so happen to sell supplements that will give you all the same benefits as eating raw organs. So if you're not tough enough to be like me, just buy my supplements. In some ways, like conservative and like traditionalist Catholicism is the same. Trads talk about how terrible and sad and lonely everything is now. Aren't you sad and aren't you lonely? Come join the closest thing to a cult without it literally being a cult, the traditionalist movement. We have the solutions that you are looking for. Now, the comparison to Liver King is probably not fair. I think that Liver King knows that he is a total and complete bullshit. And I do not think that Matt Fradd is a bullshit. I think that Matt Fradd really believes that things are terrible right now and that the answer lies in traditional Catholicism. But I think that the comparison to Dr. Paul Saladino like actually works, because I think that Paul believes what he preaches as well. I mean, like, that guy definitely is on, well, I shouldn't say definitely, but he doesn't look like he's on steroids to me. He posts videos of himself eating raw organs all the time, and I think that he like legitimately thinks that more people would be healthier if they like, you know, ate organs, and if they can't eat organs, at least take the supplements. I think that Paul really believes it, and I think that Matt really believes it. I think that they both honestly believe that there's a problem and that they both have the solution to that problem, and so they just want to offer solutions to people. But I don't think that either of those things are actually real problems, right? I don't think that the world is nearly as bad as Matt Fradd makes it out to be. And I don't think that eating organs is as important to our health as Paul makes it out to be. So I think that that comparison is actually fair. It is in your best interest if you sell a solution to make the problem seem as bad as you possibly can then, right? And that is, according to me, at least partially why traditionalists are such pessimists. But it's a complicated problem. Anyway, I'm looking forward to all the pushback in the comment sections down below that I know I'm going to receive. You all always give me something to chew on, and I doubt that today's video will be any different. Now, let me let you go for real, and I'll see you in the next one.